I mean, the one thing I know is that no one ever changed their mind by being told how stupid they are,
Right.
By somebody else.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, a Facebook Live event that will then be on YouTube and all the other interweb outlets, including as a podcast, which you will be listening to on my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Today, my guest is Charles King, professor and author. He's written a New York Times bestseller called Gods of the Upper Air. We met a few months ago in New York on a rooftop where we were doing an event related to launching my new book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. And a couple of days ago, I interviewed Maggie, who is married to Charles. And we had a wonderful talk about her book and her life and her work. And now we're going to be talking to Charles. So this is kind of unusual to do husband and wife interviews this close together. But having said all that, Charles, thank you so much for coming on today.
I'm so happy to be with you. Thanks for inviting me. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very, very much. Now I'm going to start being very facetious at the beginning here, but since Maggie sings and is wonderful and kind and gentle and lovely, do you know anybody who knows you as a couple who likes you better than Maggie?
No, absolutely no one. I have to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I say that as a man married to a wonderful, gentle, lovely woman called Jeannie, who I've been with for the last 52 years. And I don't think there's anyone who knows us. And that includes, sadly, my children and grandchildren who likes me better than they like Jeannie.
Well, I think anybody who knows both of us would say that Maggie is the essence of sweetness, and I have other qualities that may be positive as well, but she has that in addition to a sparkling intelligence and everything else. Yeah,
sparkling everything.
Yeah,
I tried to get her to sort of draw the line at, we were talking about the 1930s because of her book, talking about this village in France that saved all these people, including many Jews and others, and her family connection and the story, and we got into it. And then we sort of waxed historical a little bit and, talking about the World War II era. And the funny thing is, it's tough to get Maggie to say anything hard about anybody, even very, very bad guys. It's like, hey, I would love to have her as the prosecutor if I ever get tried for anything.
Well,
Maggie would sort of see it your way, say, yeah, there were circumstances here. And so, yeah, he's a serial killer, but you got to understand he had a rough childhood.
Well, there are life lessons in this. I think for both of us who have spent time in very difficult places, whether it's in Eastern Europe or former Soviet Union, at an earlier part in our careers, you see people in the midst of, massive social change, and you begin to wonder, how would I behave in those kind of environments? As she puts it in some of her own work, this is not about, well, that disposition is not about letting somebody else off the hook. It's about putting yourself on the hook and asking, are the times that we're living in now, for example, will they be seen by people in the future as moments in which, people should have made different choices, or at this great moment of social, political, religious, whatever change, and how could we not see this?
Well, and sometimes that's used as an excuse. There are some biographers of Jefferson, for instance, who tend to let him off the hook a little bit and say, yeah, well, those times were different. But then I always sort of remember his correspondence with Abigail Adams and John Adams, where they were people of that period, and they did not take 14-year-old slave concubines and get them pregnant and not free anybody. They were against slavery and they were calling him out. So, when people make not an excuse, but when you try to set something in context, if there are other people in that same context who do have a more enlightened view, it doesn't speak well for the people, especially if they're in direct correspondence with them, the way Abigail Adams was in correspondence with Jefferson, and he's got his big monument sitting there in Washington. And, where's one to Abigail Adams and John Adams and others who were more enlightened, you know.
Well, I think that's what you want to do as if you're trying to write history. Historians say things like, well, one of the great tools of history writing is putting things in context, but that also means trying to identify, as you said, people in any historical era who are able to see beyond the bounds of their own experience.
Yeah.
And there are great lessons in that for, how I think we behave in the here and now. To question the things that seem absolutely true, to question the verities of your own day, to question your own sense of common sense. Maggie's an anthropologist, I'm a political scientist and historian, but I think both of us have learned that common sense is often not a terribly good guide to the moment that you happen to be living in. In fact, traveling around the world, living in different societies, living in different cultures, all of that is about trying to break the obviousness of the things that you bring into the world. It's what makes you, I think, ideally a more open-minded, more cosmopolitan, if you want to use that word, individual. And it's a stuff that, it's the kind of thing that in a moment of nationalism, in a moment of where people are worried about social change, where you have the eruption of people who previously didn't have power, who are now moving into positions of power and decision-making, where everything seems to be shaking and, social mores and traditions seem to be falling all around one. The questioning your own sense of what is obvious, your own easy, quick think sense of what is true, I think is the only smart way to live. It also turns out, I think, to be a more moral way of living too.
Give me, I'm going to ask you two questions and you can give me a thumbnail on each. First of all, talk about what you do at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, where, by the way, my son Francis matriculated about 30 some years ago, where he went to school and loved it. His favorite professor was an elderly Jesuit professor who, I think when you and I talked one time, I couldn't remember his name. You sort of probably remembered who he was. You said, oh, it must have been so-and-so.
Yeah, probably Jim Schall, I think, who was a professor in the government department, and was right. A wonderful colleague of ours.
Francis and him got on very well. But give us so this is, let's go back to what you do at Georgetown and the sort of things you're teaching and interested in. But just for a minute, tell us about Gods of the Upper Air. And it's unusual that a book by an academic becomes a bestseller. Why did it become a bestseller? And tell us about it.
Well, I have no idea why it became a bestseller, and anything along those lines is all with the publisher, the publicist, and the reviewers.
Well, who published it?
So it's published by Doubleday.
What's it about?
And it is, Gods of the Upper Air is the story of kind of two things at once. The story of, in the 20th century, some of the great downsides of American life and culture and ways of seeing the world, from American racism to the rise of American nationalism, anti-immigrant movements, and so forth in this era. And at the same time, the story of a group of radical thinkers and scholars and writers who also happened to be anthropologists in New York City at this time, who also created, I think, an American antidote to some of the ills of the era as they experienced it. This group of people, some of whom became very famous, Margaret Mead, for example, Zora Neale Hurston, were all gathered together by their academic mentor, who was the head of the anthropology department at Columbia, a guy named Franz Baum, the founder of American anthropology, who set out to sort of show us that our way of seeing the world, the stuff that in the right here, right now, we think is obvious and commonsensical and hierarchical and better and so on, from our food ways to our sense of morality. Yeah. It's all situated in history, and different cultures, different societies do things differently at different times in different places. And I went around the world, Mead in American Samoa, Boas in the Canadian Arctic, to try to show that human society is one unity, planet-wide, expressed in lots of different cultures. So it's the story of this, a kind of collective biography of this group of people. And the—
Can I ask you a question about that group? You were talking about Columbia.
Yeah.
Was Jacques Barzan, the philosopher, anything to do with this? I know it's a different field, but he was at Columbia at the same time, had been there, 40 plus years. His son or grandson, I always forget who it is, but Matthew Barzan is a friend of mine, and he wound up as ambassador to the UK, appointed by Obama. Matt and I are friends, but I can't remember if Jacques was his grandfather or father, but I think I think it's his grandfather. I think Jacques Barzan was Matthew Barzan's grandfather.
Well, there's a little, so Boaz is active right at the beginning of the 20th century and then died in 1942.
Yeah.
And so much of the story that I'm telling is really the 1920s.
But he would have overlapped with Barzan, who was there for 40 plus years.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious whether there was a connection at all with that group.
I don't know, but there could well have been. I mean, Columbia hosted just an amazing array of talent not just in the social sciences, but in the natural sciences, the history department, and elsewhere. So it's an incredible.
Was Mead's work later challenged on some pretty basic levels, or have I got that wrong?
No, you're right. I mean, there was a great controversy after she died in the 1970s, particularly in the 1980s and early 1990s. And sort of it's interesting that I think a couple of the negative reviews of the book.
Of your book?
Of mine, right?
Oh, yeah.
Of Gods of the Upper Air.
Which is Gods of the Upper Air.
Yeah. There were a couple out of some really very wonderful positive ones, but I think the reviewers hadn't quite checked in on Mead and Mead's studies, if you like, since some of those controversies of the 80s. There was one scholar in particular back in that time who had spent much of his life trying to take down Mead because he thought she was a charlatan and not a serious scholar and so on.
Yeah.
But I think anyone who has read her notebooks, as I have at the Library of Congress, you could not accuse her of having made things up or sort of.
Wasn't some of the critique of her work, which I'm not saying I share because I don't have enough knowledge to share it or not share it, but wasn't it that she brought too much of a rosy perspective to some of her studies in terms of the people she was studying?
I don't think that's true. I mean, I think if you read sort of her first great work, Coming of Age in Samoa, published in 1928,
right.
She doesn't paint a rosy picture of American Samoa as she found it at the time at all.
Right.
But you also have to understand what she was trying to do, both in that work and I think in a lot of her later work. She was trying to hold up a mirror to the society she knew best, to the United States. And especially later on as she was writing the 1950s and 1960s, as she became one of the sort of key figures in the early feminist movement, and she helped to revolutionize child rearing and all sorts of things. She was battling some pretty ingrained prejudices and was using the anthropological work she had done around the world as a lever against that.
But I think that the critique of her, if I remember correctly, was also linked to the critique of the field in saying that, in trying to hold a mirror up to the iniquities of the West, to put it that way, or US culture. And of course, this goes for politics of the left as well during the 30s and 40s, comparing us unfavorably to what turned out to be Stalin's Soviet Union, for instance, that there's always been this propensity for thinking somehow that not only are we failing, true enough, but that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. And if we could just be like these more primitive natural people who are less disciplinarian with their children or do this or that or the other thing, find no problem with nudity or, various versions of sexuality, everything would be fine. But the idea being that when you dig a little deeper into those cultures, they also had their problems. And it's not so much a comparison of the West to these ideal primitive societies, but that the human condition itself is fraud. And there is no place to point to say, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we were a little more like these guys? Have I totally got it wrong, or was that some of the discussion?
Yeah, I don't think Mead or her colleagues would have believed that they had found a kind of Shangri-La or Brigadoon in some other part of the world. But I think they did believe that it was perfectly reasonable to look at other cultures, other societies, and ask how people created meaningful lives in this context. And to insist, actually, that people did create meaningful lives in those contexts. and that some societies, which were labeled primitive or backward at the time, had places for people that might be labeled that we might now call disabled,
yes,
in a society that we're more familiar with, or people that were at the time, the 1950s, 60s, 30s, 40s, labeled people of deviant sexuality. There were other societies and other contexts in which those people had not only had meaningful lives, but were socially placed, meaning there was a category for a person like that allowed them to flourish, or at least to have a meaningful, productive life in that society. So rather than compare one culture with the other and find one wanting and the other perfect, what I think they were trying to do is simply say there are lots of different solutions to common human problems.
Right.
How do you get married well? How do you raise a child? What do you do with your parents when they get old? What does it mean to live a meaningful life? What's good to eat? Like, these are human universals, and those questions are the things that make humanity one. Not the answers, but the questions are the things that unite.
Well, you've just written a new foreword to the second edition of my book that'll, by that time, I hope be a bestseller in a year or two. Because essentially that's what my new book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, is about, is the common evolutionary thread that binds us all together and actually gives us a plan that works, which is put relationships and how you care for others ahead of, say, your career description. But okay, now I got my plug in for my book, I can relax. Let me get back to your book here.
And it's a great cover. It's a great cover too. I like it behind
it. It is. It's a good cover. And by the way, here's the first copy I got from the printer for real. Yesterday, we got a box full that I'm taking to New York to a second rooftop event like the one you came to.
Yep.
But okay, so Gods of the Upper Air, and then what you teach at the School of Foreign Service, which, by the way, is a wonderful place. Having visited when my son was there, I love that, and it's the best part of Georgetown. In case anybody wonders what the best part of the school is, you hear about the law school, but the School of Foreign Service is the whole deal.
Well, I have to say, I've got great colleagues in Georgetown College and the McDonough School of Business and plenty of other places too. It's a wonderful university.
Yeah, it's great.
I've been there for 25 years now. It's hard to believe. And I've taught everything from an intro political science class with about 250 students in the lecture hall, to first semester seminars for students in the School of Foreign Service on, I used to teach a class called Guns that was about the gun debate. That was a sort of a first year seminar. I teach a course called Ethnicity, Race, and Nation, which takes all those concepts and tries to compare them and smush them together and look at the American experience in the context of how other societies have dealt with categories like those and ones similar to them. I teach a course on writing for our students in international affairs, where we look at all different types of nonfiction narrative writing. And I love doing that. The students make me better. They energize me, and I always feel like, the academic new year begins in late August or early September, when all these students rush back to campus. And now, of course, even though I'm not on campus right at the moment, my colleagues who are teaching this semester have really reported the incredible energy and optimism from having.
Is your last stint there, was it virtual Zoomy stuff, or were you in person?
Yeah, so I've actually been on sabbatical because I stepped down from an administrative job about close to 18 months ago now, but I began my time away by finishing a semester online.
Okay, so you went through that experience.
So I went through the early stages of that with my colleagues, yeah.
Yeah, let me change gears here, and I'm going to throw two things out that are completely unrelated, but I'll give you warning, and then if I forget which one the second one was, you can get back to it. One, I want to know how you met Maggie and talk about that and that relationship within the kind of academic context and all that. I'm always interested in love stories and the rest, and personal history more than professional history, really. And then secondly, to double back to what we were talking about with Margaret Mead and the others, I grew up in an evangelical fundamentalist household, but my father was somewhat of an intellectual, and his whole shtick was what people in his field and your field would call apologetics, which is presenting the case for what you believe, but using facts and ideas and analysis from outside. For instance, a very basic idea of his being that evangelical Protestant Christianity of Northern Europe produced better social, political, and economic results than Southern European Roman Catholicism, which as an evangelical fundamentalist, born-again Christian, he saw as suspect, but that Southern Roman Catholicism produced better results in turn than, say, Islam, which was a very foreign, wrong idea. And that in turn, because it at least had an Abrahamic covenant involved in it, produced better results than, say, Hinduism. By the time you get there, you're into absolute paganism. No wonder their water is dirty. No wonder nothing works. He would look at history, anthropology, social policy as a mine from which to I guess, fish for facts that would support a basic idea that somehow you could prove Christianity was true and that the biblical account was true based on the results in the culture around you. And of course, then there were problems like, why did Martin Luther lead directly in a straight line to the Holocaust? Why did Bach do wonderful Christian music in Germany and then not, and I blink long later in terms of history, the world of Bach and Dürer and all these other people, Lucas Cranach and everything is all of a sudden, being taken over by the Nazis, and what your wife Maggie writes about in terms of what then impacts France. So there were problems, but he would look at things like feminism leading to abortion. He would look at these things. These were all apologetic arguments. And so I'm interested on a couple of things I'm going to throw out at you, having set the stage for this. Do you ever run into students that you're teaching who come at their studies with you from an evangelical white Christian background, similar to the one I came from, which produces a lot of intelligent people, but who would bring to the table a sort of Francis Schaefferian, to use my dad's name, apologetic method? 2, what do you think about the idea anyway? And 3, does the left or progressive or secular people within the academic community actually do the same thing themselves, rather hypocritically, by flipping the table and looking for the evidence of failure within the idea systems that they oppose? Okay, there's a lot there, and I'm going to shut up now and let you riff on this for a long, long time, but I think it's a pretty good question.
That's a lot on the table. That's an essay, a very complicated essay exam.
Okay.
With discuss at the end of
now discuss amongst yourselves.
Okay, so your first question, Maggie Paxson and I met at a dinner party in Washington, which is a very Washington-y way to meet, I think. And some friends of ours may have set us up.
How long ago was that?
Well, we just celebrated our 13th wedding anniversary.
Okay.
This month. So, but I have to say, she makes me smarter every day, and our breakfast, lunch, and dinner tables are kind of seminars in the state of the world and social science and you name it. And I couldn't have written a book that has anthropologists at its core without having one in the household.
I was going to ask about that because it's not actually sort of your field, but here you've written a best-selling book kind of about that.
Yeah, about her field.
Yeah.
And she was absolutely essential to that. She's the smartest person I know, and I'm feel very lucky to be married to her.
Yeah.
On the bigger set of issues you raise about your own background and your father's work and so forth, I think in my own teaching, I probably rarely run into kids who had introduced themselves as evangelical.
Sure.
I teach at a Jesuit and Catholic.
Well, what about conservative Roman Catholic? Just interject there. There's got to be some people who like the Latin Mass and all that who are still at Georgetown.
Yeah, there are kids like that and families like that around, and I like to think that if I can use an Episcopalian term about a Catholic university, that it's a broad church.
Yeah. As
a broad church approach to religion, to faith, full stop, and it's a place where everybody should feel welcome and free to express their point of view. But I think where the line is drawn for me is kind of right at the frontier of apologetics. So that if you begin with the idea that a thing must be true, and then I will look for evidence to support the thing that I know must be true, that is not the same thing to me as genuinely open intellectual inquiry.
Right.
It is certainly true that we all bring blinders to how we're analyzing any kind of problem. You know, we all have priors, we all have sets of beliefs, we all have our own version of faith, whatever that is. But the work that you have to do, and it's hard work, is to put as much of that on hold as you can by ideally having as many conversations as you can with people who think differently from you. And, you know, I think you're right that there is a certain version of American intellectual life that is less familiar with a whole broad array of arguments about, for example, about religion. Like, what does it mean to take faith seriously? What does it mean to take religion seriously? To feel that deep tug of, you know, one's own background and one's own faith tradition, if you have one.
Speaking of which, let me ask you just right there. Are you a churchy person?
Well, so I grew up in the Assemblies of God. I grew up as an evangelical Christian myself, and it is while I've moved a lot on issues of faith over the course of my life, when I begin to think about big ultimate questions, that's the place I kind of go back to. So
do you go to church?
No, so I don't. There's not a church that I regularly attend. So I'm not part of a religious community, but I feel very profoundly that the faith I grew up with, especially in big moments of life, you know, big nodal points of life that any anthropologist would chart in any society, that tradition is a kind of language that is meaningful and important to me. I sometimes say I'm a Christian in the way that I speak English, that I realize there are many languages in the world, and I speak some other languages too, and can do that pretty convincingly. But there is one that I'm really very comfortable in, and it's one that I can best use to make sense of some very big questions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah. So I sometimes call it, you know, it's my language of ultimate things. And you know, what is disappointing to me about the moment we happen to be living in is that it is the faith tradition that I came from that has been hijacked by a very narrow version of American nationalism, right? So
speaking of which, a little while ago, I was interviewing Dr. Balmer from he used to teach at Columbia, and now he's up at Dartmouth, and he teaches this history, and he came from an evangelical background and is actually now an ordained Episcopal priest, very much speaking the same language you are. And his whole point while we were talking was to remind people yet again that yes, this white evangelical group has taken over the Republican Party, but from his point of view, what a pity that they've denied their own inheritance as spearheading the abolitionist movement. And he says, you know, there was a period in American history when the evangelicals were the left, because they were the people bringing up child labor. They were the people who were on the abolition side. And sure, there was that dark side with the Southern Baptists that broke away to defend slavery, but nevertheless, evangelicals were not of the right. Okay, parentheses over, but the point is well taken.
Yeah, and you know, it strikes me that particularly I come from the Pentecostal end of the evangelical movement.
And what part of the country were you in?
So I grew up in Arkansas.
Okay, so you're in Arkansas in a Pentecostal church. Did you ever hear of?
Grew up on a farm.
Pardon me?
I grew up on a farm.
Yeah, so you're the real deal.
But that version of the evangelical tradition, that's serious stuff. That's the Sufism of Christianity.
Right.
It is this highly spiritual, highly speculative, the belief in miracles in the present moment, the belief in prophecy in the present moment. It is, it's a theological churn, right?
Yes.
Because you're not just relying on ancient texts, you're relying on human experience right in the present. It's actually a super exciting version of faith. And then to see versions of that become regimented and cemented, and to replace a kind of narrow American nationalism, to replace an understanding of the gospel and the revolutionary nature of those ideas with a version of American nationalism is very sad to me.
Let me segue from that into something here. First of all, just remind people you are watching and or listening to the podcast In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Today, I'm talking to Charles King. Charles King is a professor at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He's also the author of a New York Times bestseller, Gods of the Upper Air. He is also married to Maggie, who I interviewed here a little while ago, and some of you will remember that. Let me segue from that and just say, getting into the present predicament of the evangelical community, now being the spearhead of the white nationalist movement, now being the people who, as we record this, account for the most of those anti-vaccine folks who are endangering others by having bought into a lot of very right-wing propagandistic misinformation, seeking to undermine the Biden presidency with this sort of failure to deal with COVID, a self-fulfilling prophecy since they're not getting vaccinated. It's become a really dirty business. And Trump not only had the support of the white evangelical voters, 83% of them. Sadly, a lot of that had to do with anti-abortion stances, which my family had a lot to do with in the 70s and 80s, and had been credited, if you want to call it that, in bringing the evangelical cohort into the pro-life movement, when before it was more of a Catholic issue. And incidentally, a little parenthetical comment here, our big battle was with other evangelical leaders at the time, like Dr. Billy Graham, who was pro-choice, Dr. Criswell, president of the Southern Baptist Convention, who at that time was also pro-choice, et cetera, the editors of Christianity Today magazine, Billy Graham's magazine, pro-choice, Wheaton College, with teachers there who, like Mark Knoll and Marsden and others, who would not join in with us. And so we were in on the start of that. So my question to you is, looking forward now that you came out of that background and your academic career analyzes such things as political policy and other stuff, has the evangelical movement disappeared in America and been replaced by a white nationalist movement that no longer remembers what it is? Or is this a group of people who can be called back to something that looks more like Christianity as we would have defined it, say in the 70s and 80s before this all took off?
Well,
where next? What comes next?
It's a good question. I mean, the one thing I know is that no one ever changed their mind by being told how stupid they are,
right?
By somebody else. And if I look at the arc of my own life, the thing that was so important in how I evolved, I guess, was some very careful teachers, people who spent the time to gently care for me and my brain and my heart in quite extraordinary ways that I now, if you want to put a religious gloss on it, I see as a kind of act of grace, on their part. And so that was a long journey, my own kind of long journey from from a teenager within the church. And, youth groups can be kind of radical places when you're inside a religious organization, all the way to being the kind of person that I am now. So at an individual level, I think it is absolutely the case that human beings can change their mind about things. And we've seen some remarkable evidence of that. I mean, look at Liz Cheney's view on marriage equality,
Sure.
and the transformation of her view on that, on just that issue is one example. But I think there are also big institutional questions that have to do with the relationship between an ideology that is nationalistic and religious and race specific, in the United States, and actual representative democracy.
Yeah.
Because we're in a moment right now, I think, in the history of the United States that is not unlike that I saw in other countries in Eastern Europe, where, social change begins to rattle an existing kind of order. And you saw that in the United States during the civil rights movement, where white Southerners, were so deeply worried about the transformation of everything from what their school looked like to the flags that they saluted, to their position of power in that society. And it took the progressive, not only education of individuals over time, but a set of institutional transformations to unbuild that of course are not even finished yet in the South. So we're at this moment where I think one has to have institutional changes that allow greater access, that ensure the right to vote, that allow greater access to positions of power, because in country after country, we see what can happen to democracy when the group that feels threatened by social change seeks to trade actual democracy for maintaining themselves in power, and that's kind of where we are, I think, in the U.S. right now.
Do you see, from gerrymandering to voter suppression to all these crazy laws in Texas and all these other states, I mean, obviously, it is a conscious move to try to preclude the event of minority, which is now becoming the majority, brown people, those from other non-Western backgrounds and so forth, from becoming the majority. I lived in South Africa for a year during the end of the apartheid era, and the kind of thing that they achieved through apartheid, which was a 40 or 50-year period, from 1947, I think it was, when it became official, until the late 1980s when Mandela was released. I think a lot of folks on the more progressive side have this illusion that somehow a shrinking minority of white people that tend towards authoritarianism and deliberately try to undermine the vote by either saying the election was stolen and or actually stealing elections themselves later, by putting people in place, unlike some of the Republicans who stood up against Trump, replacing those folks in various states who won't stand up. I have no answer for this. This is not a rhetorical question, but are we really going to lose our democracy, or is this just hyperbole from the left? Because it looks to me like you could argue it either way, but it seems to me these Republicans really don't care about the democratic system anymore, in a way that you would have assumed even 10 years ago could never happen in our lifetimes.
Well, I think it's not so much about the loss of a system, because, even on the left, I mean, perhaps especially on the left, it's very clear that there was not some nostalgic moment in the past when the United States was a perfect multiracial democracy that the current Republican Party is attempting to unbuild. So to me, I think it's perhaps a little more enlightening to talk about some clashing values in the United States right at the moment. On the one hand, you have a sizable portion of the electorate, and not exclusively on the left, that believes that a society is more just when it allows more voices to be heard, in which, whether that's access to the ballot box and simply making it as easy as possible for people to cast a ballot, to make their political voice heard. And another set of values that believes in things like order, that, that a society is best structured when it has a certain hierarchy to it. And surprise, surprise, the best hierarchy is one that just happens to place people like myself on top. And, whatever categories I happen to belong to, places those individuals at the top of the heap. And so that clash is not new, right? That debate battle has been a constant of American history. And so if we can simply awaken ourselves to the way in which those battles are still to be fought today, at the ballot box, in Congress, that those are, in school boards, these are constants of American history, not a moment that has simply come in with Trump or with Trumpism. He was a particularly egregious representative of one set of those values, but he's not at all.
It seems, looking at what we've been talking about before in this conversation with my dad's ideas about apologetics, that of course one of his ideas that he put forward in his books, which were tremendously influential in the evangelical community in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and really helped, if you want to put it that way, politicize the movement, was this idea that we had departed from our Judeo-Christian foundation. We need to come back to that. It has been taken from us, and it bred this idea of victimization, that even though it may appear that white, males are in the majority and they run everything, that actually underneath there's this insidious movement from the left and from sexual deviance and from all these other people to take away what belongs to us. And then, of course, there's a racial element to that as well, that was less what my dad was about, but some of his cohort, like Jerry Falwell, who was a segregationist, and started a great deal of his own activity in reaction to white schools losing tax-exempt status when they had been founded as a reaction to integration and so forth. This idea of a Christian America, which is fondly held onto by the right, and also used as an excuse to take away freedoms from the present tense in order to get back to our, quote, true foundation. That seems to me something that keeps being played out in this discussion, at least from the group of people that I come from.
Yeah, well, it's not right. And that to me is no different from things that I've seen in many other countries where I've traveled and lived and
we'll talk about some of those. Which countries?
I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe and former Yugoslavia and Romania and Ukraine, in the countries of the Caucasus and Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And in each of those societies, there is some version of what it means to be a true and legitimate member of that society.
And today in Hungary, they're doing the same thing. That's coming up.
In Hungary is another example. Yeah. So who does this piece of real estate really belong to? Who made it great? Whose heroes are to be celebrated and whose are to be treated as enemies? So the American version of this, and this is part of why I wanted to kind of turn and write in Gods of the Upper Air about the United States. The American version of this is not any different. The American version just has certain terms and phrases that are meaningful in this context, a term like race, for example, which is deeply important in America, but it functions very similarly to how ethnicity or nationalism function in other parts of the world. Yeah. So getting back to those anthropologists I was writing about in the book, they were trying to show us that the American experience is in that way not unique. And we just happen to be living in a moment where that, white Christian America, evangelical version of what it means to be a true American is just so front and center because you had a very talented politician whose survival and success depended on doing exactly that.
Yeah, moving forward, let me just say that you're watching or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and today we are talking with Maggie Paxson's wonderful husband, Charles King. That's how I'm going to identify you. It's like the people I meet when I'm walking Zip, my dog, in the morning. I know their dogs' names. I forget theirs. Maggie Paxson, she sings and she plays a guitar and she sings in French. Okay, we're going to remember who she is, and then we come to Charles King, and I think he wrote a book about something to do with Maggie's Field.
Correct. Exactly
okay.
Right. Exactly right.
I want to throw out something, and I tend to sound like I'm, more certain of ideas than I am just because I put them robustly. I grew up as a preacher's son, so forgive that. And I'm not putting this out as the truth. I'm just here how I'm going to say it. Sometimes I get invited on television by people like Rachel Maddow and Joy Reid and others to explain some aspect of the evangelical, whatever, coming to the fore, as if somehow it's a uniquely American problem. And what I try to tell people, and often don't have the time in those short formats of being a talking head, but would like to lay out here for your reaction, is this. My view is that what's happened in the US with Donald Trump, of course, is a strange thing because he's a con artist and he's a thief and he's all those things. He's also a skilled politician. But when you take his weirdness out of it, that just as you were saying, it's actually part of a worldwide phenomena, but I'd put it this way, and that is from the Wahhabist takeover of Saudi Arabia through the imams who manipulated the royal family to get what they wanted, which was a radical form of Islam that eventually produced al-Qaeda, which was basically funded and generated out of the Saudis, even though that's not who we wound up blaming. The Iranian Revolution, in which puts an Ayatollah coming from Paris into Iran to throw the Shah out, who was, of course, corrupt and et cetera, but nevertheless creating a theocracy there. Hindu nationalism in India coming to the fore with Modi and everything that's happened. The radicalization of Pakistan now becoming adjunct to the Taliban with 110 or so nuclear weapons, which will be an issue at some point. The nationalistic fervor going back to Confucian Chinese philosophy in China, that is basically trying to give legitimacy to the second wave of the communist movement, but also, again, around nationalism. That when I was in the 20th century and Aldous Huxley and all these people were holding forth, the idea was we Christians are out of it. It's going to be a secular universe now. Sorry, folks. It turns out that all we've got is wars of religion. All we have is Jewish occupiers of the West Bank claiming they've been sent there by God, being supported by American evangelical Zionists who don't care about Jews, but do care about the return of Christ. It's like we've gone to another planet. And not only is it all about religion and ethnic identity, but that the American phenomena, far from being unique, is just part of a worldwide slide toward a confrontation between all kinds of forms of religious and social and fundamentalism and any view of science or progress that might have been identified, say, mid-20th century as progressive. And we're in the middle of a worldwide confrontation between these things. There's a lot more similarity between Modi's nationalism and Hinduism of India and Donald Trump's white evangelical followers than there is between anybody who had a kind of a scientific or rational or post-Enlightenment view, say 50 years ago. Now, again, I put that in superlatives and too strongly, and it doesn't sound academic, so your hackles are probably up, but now give us a more modest view of that makes sense.
Okay. Well, I do think, if we were having this conversation 20 or 30 years ago,
yeah,
when Sam Huntington wrote that political scientist from Harvard wrote that infamous, in some ways, article called "A Clash of Civilizations."
Yeah, I remember.
Affairs, which he argued that the coming dividing lines around the globe were going to be these civilizational, which to Huntington meant kind of religious clashes. In fact, I think history has worked out in exactly the opposite way, that rather than a clash, there's a convergence, exactly along the lines that you mentioned. In the 1970s or 80s, it would have been called fundamentalist. There was a great worry, especially after 79, after the Iranian Revolution, about the rise of different kinds of fundamentalisms. But I think we're also living in a moment now in which the fusion of political authoritarianism, ethnic nationalism, and worry about social change, the rapidity of social change pushed by globalization, that all of those things come together in a slightly different form with different shadings depending on the cultural context. But you can't look at Trump or a Modi or an Orban in Hungary and not see the same, or go back a ways, a George Wallace,
sure,
and not see the same person. In fact, one of the things that I have my students do is to read Wallace's famous inaugural speech as governor, which when you start pulling it apart and just don't think about the historical context for a moment, but just look at the text, he is saying things that any ethnic nationalist in 2021
sure,
could say. And then you begin to do the genealogy and see, well, where does Christianist nationalism in the United States come from? Well, you see it laid out exactly there. But the caveat I will give is that these religious movements are incredibly adaptive. Mm-hmm. that it is perfectly possible for a political authoritarian to claim the mantle of religious purity,
sure,
while at the same time encouraging the development of science and creating vaccines and doing, that all of those things come together. So what I sometimes call this is, sort of anti-modern modernism, because the folks are really comfortable with many of the benefits of modernization and globalization for that matter, while at the same time using some of these ideologies to keep themselves in power.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what the Chinese did when they decided it was, quote, to quote their leader at that time, it is glorious to be rich, but also to continue the communist system, and so you've seen this play out. What surprises me, however, about the era we're in now is that none of this, or little of this, was foreseen. I mean, to take an example, for instance, we always talked back in the 70s and 80s about religious liberty being trampled on, and the people who wanted white schools and tax exemption for them used that, and so forth and so on. But, now you have Amy Coney Barrett and the Supreme Court basically telling evangelicals that their rights have been trampled. And so if you want to meet in a church without masks or vaccines, it's your religious right to do so, to become a super spreader. We're going to guarantee that. And then on the other hand, we're going to look the other way in Texas when people of your ilk want to sue somebody who drives a woman to an abortion clinic. When you add all this up, there is a whiff of a push toward what I think has to be described as theocracy, because it's like there's now two levels entering into the highest reaches of American law and jurisprudence, where suddenly the victimology the evangelicals have developed over the years is part of their own mantra that we are being put upon. So we have to take our kids out of school, homeschool them, because otherwise they'll get all this secular stuff. When Trump began to sell part of his platform as I will defend your rights, I'll defend religious liberty, and people like Ralph Reed and all these other evangelical leaders played into it, you now see working out in the actual court appointments people who seem to agree with this idea that religious liberty trumps other liberties. How do you see that playing out in the future? Have I got it all wrong?
Well, I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, we do have a constitution that creates a hierarchy of liberties, and religious liberty is one of them, and the right to own guns is, the right of an individual to own guns is another one of them. So some of this is baked into the American political system. I think I'm less worried about the idea of a national theocracy, because I don't think there's stomach for that kind of thing. I don't think there's belief in it. I take members of the Supreme Court at their word on that issue, on that set of issues. But I am increasingly concerned about what happens at local levels, because from the civil rights movement forward, the role of the federal government has been to try to equalize access to power, to resources, to the ballot box across a country that for most of its history was an authoritarian patchwork, and that's what the civil rights laws were for. That was what the ability of the federal government to monitor particular states and their voting rights access was all about. And we have progressively, even going back before the Trump administration, we have unbuilt that safety net for broad American democracy. And what I do worry about is going back to this system in which federalism is a kind of excuse for a quasi-authoritarian systems at the state or local level.
Yeah, I think that, you know, when you look at where we are now, of course, the big immediate question is, does the Biden agenda work? Does Trump win another term and come back in 2024? Does the House flip back to the Republicans? But the big story, it seems to me, a lot of commentators have pointed this out. This is not an original idea, but it also is on the local level, what's happening in the states. Because when you look at the divide between the red and the blue states on the state level, it really almost seems like a Cold War version of the Civil War being replayed, because these are entrenched positions, and I don't see that going away. So I guess I'm going to ask a kind of loaded question. My son, who is a Marine, fought in Afghanistan at the beginning of that war, came home safe, and I do daily daycare for 3 of their young children. But as I look at this history of the U.S. since Vietnam, you know, we have Vietnam, we have Iraq, we have our confrontation with Iran that did not go well, although it wasn't a shooting war outright. And then Afghanistan, you know, America keeps losing wars, it keeps losing face. And then on the home front, we seem to be re-arguing things that we took for granted in terms of access to voting and this kind of stuff. You know, this sounds like a pretentiously big question, but where do you think the U.S. is headed? I mean, are you of the opinion that this is it in terms of we are now in an inevitable slide in terms of being a world power away from that? We've lost credibility. Is this salvageable? Is the future bright? Is it dark? I mean, how do you actually see? How do you see? No, but your students must ask you this. It's a very sophomore question, and I'm asking it. What do you think is happening?
It's not. It's the kind of thing I would ask on an essay exam to try to see what my students thought. I think there's absolutely no question that the United States is in decline. If we mean relative decline, you know, this is not the late Cold War. The adversary that had a fundamentally different political system, an economic system from the United States, is no longer there. It hasn't, you know, it hasn't just collapsed so that the United States could feel that somehow that its economic, political, cultural, social system was so evidently superior to everyone else's on the planet. You know, as you have the rise, the emergence, because of market systems and globalization, of other societies and other political systems around the world, the relative power of the United States is not, you know, will get smaller and smaller, I think. The great question for the moment, it seems to me, is whether, you know, the United States can find ways of saying goodbye gracefully, goodbye to that version of America in the world gracefully, you know, and this is kind of the question for great powers from, you know, for a very long time, that if you can find ways of preserving the best part of whatever you think your values are, and then imparting those to other societies, other states, other civilizations around the world, that will have been a time on the historical stage that was worth it. I'm not feeling particularly good about our ability to do that right at the moment, simply because we seem to have divided ourselves into 2 great camps that don't listen very well across that divide, and seem to be in a process of, you know, ramping up a kind of confrontation across that barrier.
Yeah, I mean, almost a war of internal annihilation, not literally, thank God yet, but very much so. No room for anything. Let me remind people, you've been watching and listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm participating in a porch course with my friend Gareth Higgins, who founded the Wild Goose Festival that I've participated in for many years, beginning in mid-January, and it's based on my new book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, which will be in bookstores or online, available November 2nd. Please pre-order if you can. And by the way, nobody will be turned away from the Porch course for lack of funds. There is a fee to pay, but all you have to do is say you can't pay it, and you'll be on the course anyway. Please visit the Porch course at porchcourses.com, and I would appreciate it if you would not only order my book, but like this podcast and this conversation and spread the word, because these things are all word of mouth. And it all depends on the support of folks who are watching and listening for both the book and for what we've been discussing. And Charles, just to finish up here, you're going to be on sabbatical for how long before you go back to school to teach?
So I'll be teaching it in the spring. So in January, I'm back at Georgetown teaching.
Yeah, that's really good. And Maggie was telling me that next stop after Scotland is Venice.
Yeah, well, this has been a fabulous sabbatical. We finally made it over here, and we're gonna go to Venice for a month, and then a little bit of tooling around after that, and then back.
That's really lovely, and I wish you such a lovely trip. And thank you for indulging my podcast in the middle of your sabbatical and vacation when you're trying to rest yourself in your brain, and then here you are talking to me, and I'm dragging you back, kicking and screaming into.
Happy to do it. Happy to do it. And congratulations on the book again, Frank.
Thank you. And listen, please thank Maggie again for a good interview, and thank you to you for a really, really, really wonderful one. Let's do one again. And how about sometime when you're done your sabbatical and back in the saddle, that we do a podcast with you and Maggie and me and talk about the relationship of both of your projects together.
Sure, that'd be terrific.
It'd be nice to have you back on. And I want to get her to play some music or sing for us, or do something to do the whole thing. So yeah, this was really good discussion. Thank you so much, and really enlightening. Thank you for all your wisdom and guidance through this. Thank you.
Yep. Talk to you later.